Put your finger in the middle of your Bible, right in the crack between the Old Testament and the New. Between the last page of Malachi and the first page of Matthew, there's a gap so thin you could miss it. Just white space, the turn of a single page, and that single page is hiding 400 years. Here's how strange that gap is. On the last page of the Old Testament, you're in a world of prophets and priests and the fading echo of the exile. You turn one page and suddenly the world is unrecognizable. There are Roman soldiers standing in the streets of Jerusalem. There's a king named Herod on the throne, a man who isn't even fully Jewish. There are two rival religious parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, arguing in the temple courts, and neither of them appears anywhere in the Old Testament. There's a ruling council called the Sanhedrin. There are synagogues in every town, and the Hebrew scriptures have somehow been translated into Greek. None of it is explained. The Bible doesn't stop to catch you up. Matthew opens with a genealogy and just assumes you already know how the world got from there to here. But you don't know, because nobody told you what happened in the gap. So that's what this video is. In those 400 years, God said nothing. No prophet, no new scripture, no voice from heaven. And yet inside that silence, 4 empires rose and fell over the land of Israel. The Jewish faith nearly died and fought its way back, and the entire world was quietly rearranged into the precise shape the message of Jesus would need to spread. By the end of this, you'll see that the silence was never empty. It was the loudest 400 years in history. You just have to know what to listen for. Let's start at the moment the voice goes quiet. The year is somewhere around 430 BC. The prophet Malachi is writing the final book of the Old Testament, and the mood is not triumphant. You might expect the Old Testament to end on a high note. The people home from exile, the temple rebuilt, worship restored. All of that is technically true. The Jews have been back in their land for about 100 years, but Malachi is writing to a nation that has gone spiritually cold. The priests are cutting corners, offering God sick and blemished animals they wouldn't dare give a governor. The people are holding back what they owe, and most telling of all, they've started to mutter that following God simply isn't worth it, that there's no payoff in keeping his commands. These aren't outsiders. This is the covenant people, a century removed from a miracle, already tired and cynical, still waiting for the Messiah their prophets had promised, and starting to doubt he was ever coming. And into that weariness, God speaks his last recorded words for 4 centuries. They're not soft. They're a promise wrapped around a warning. One day he says, I will send the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, to turn the hearts of parents and children back to one another, so the land isn't struck with a curse. Then the scroll rolls shut, and there's something fitting in the messenger's own name. Malachi means my messenger. The final prophet's name is literally his job description, and when his message ends, the messenger goes quiet, and Israel is left holding a promise with no idea when it will be kept. 400 years of no answer, but not 400 years of nothing. Because while heaven was silent, the earth was anything but, and it starts with the empire that was already in charge. When Malachi lays down his pen, the Jews are living under the Persian Empire, and as far as foreign rulers go, the Persians are about as good as it gets. It was the Persian king Cyrus who, decades earlier, had let the exiles go home and even funded the rebuilding of the temple. His successors backed the work of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Persians let the Jews run their own religious affairs, with the high priest serving as the community's real leader. On the surface, these are calm years, but underneath the calm, something quietly enormous is taking shape, and it has to do with language. The generations that came back from Babylon came back changed. 70 years in a foreign empire had done what foreign empires always do. It had reshaped how ordinary people talked. Many Jews no longer spoke fluent Hebrew in daily life. Their everyday language had become Aramaic, the common tongue of the whole region, and that created a spiritual problem with huge consequences. If your scriptures are written in Hebrew, but you can no longer read Hebrew, how do you stay connected to your own God? The answer was a brand new kind of institution, the synagogue. Think about this carefully, because it matters. The temple in Jerusalem was for sacrifice. There was only one, and it was far away for most people. But the synagogue was for study, a local gathering place where a community could come together to hear the scriptures read, have them explained in the language they actually spoke, and pray. There's no command to build synagogues in the law of Moses. They grew up during and after the exile as a practical fix for a scattered, displaced people. And by the time Jesus is born, there's a synagogue in nearly every Jewish town in the world. He'll spend his ministry walking into them, unrolling the scroll, and teaching. That entire pattern, the thing that gives Jesus a built-in platform in every village, is a product of the silent years. Persia planted it. But Persia's day was ending. Off to the west, a young man was about to move faster than any conqueror in history and change the world in a way no army ever had. In 336 BC, a 20-year-old inherits a throne and an army in the kingdom of Macedon. His name is Alexander. Within about a decade, he conquers everything from Greece to the edge of India, and he dies in Babylon before his 33rd birthday, having never lost a battle. History would call him Alexander the Great. In 332 BC, he passes through the land of Israel on his way to Egypt. And here's the surprise: he doesn't burn Jerusalem or crush its religion. By the account of the Jewish historian Josephus, Alexander actually treated the Jewish leadership with respect and left their worship alone. But what Alexander left behind was far more powerful than any conquest and far more lasting. He left behind Greek language, Greek learning, Greek ideas, Greek ways of building and thinking and doing business. Historians call this spread Hellenization, and it wasn't enforced at sword point, it was a flood. Greek became the shared language of the entire Mediterranean world. If you wanted to trade across borders, you did it in Greek. If you wanted to be educated, you learned Greek. For the next 3 centuries, right up to the time of Christ and beyond, Greek was the one language that could carry an idea from one end of the known world to the other. Hold on to why that matters, because it's staggering. When the letters of the New Testament are written to churches in Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, and Philippi, they aren't written in Hebrew or Aramaic, they're written in Greek. When the 4 Gospels are set down, they're written in Greek. The entire New Testament comes to us in the language Alexander poured across the world 300 years before it was needed. Alexander died young and left no heir, so his generals carved up his empire. For Israel, that meant living in the crossfire between 2 rival dynasties for the next century and a half, first the Greek rulers of Egypt, then the Greek rulers of Syria. But under the Egyptian years, something happened that may be the single most important thing to come out of the whole silence. In the great city of Alexandria, home to one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. For the first time ever, the Old Testament existed in the language the whole world could read. That translation is called the Septuagint. The name comes from the word for 70, because tradition says around 70 Jewish scholars did the work. Sit with what that unlocked. Before this, the promises of a coming Messiah, the prophecies of Isaiah about a suffering servant, the Psalms, the covenant with Abraham, all of it was locked behind a language wall. After the Septuagint, any Greek-speaking person anywhere could read them. So when the Apostle Paul stands up in a synagogue in some far-off Greek city and argues that Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy, he's quoting a Greek Bible his audience already owns. When Matthew points again and again to fulfilled prophecy, he's building on a text his readers already know by heart. The Septuagint was a delivery system for the gospel, and it was built by people who had no idea yet what their own scriptures were pointing to. The stage was being set, but before the drama could begin, the Jewish faith would have to survive being nearly wiped out by a king who thought he was a god. In 175 BC, a new king takes the Syrian throne, and he is a different animal entirely. His name is Antiochus IV, and he gives himself the title Epiphanes, God Manifest. Behind his back, some of his own people twisted it into Epimanes, the madman. Antiochus wanted one culture, one people, one way of life across his whole empire, Greek. For most of his subjects, that was no crisis. But for the Jews, whose entire identity was bound up in being set apart for their God, it was a death sentence for the faith, and Antiochus pressed it deliberately. He made keeping the covenant a crime, circumcision outlawed, punishable by death, the Sabbath forbidden, studying the law banned. Jews were ordered to sacrifice to Greek gods and to eat what their scriptures called unclean. And then Antiochus did the unthinkable, the act that would burn itself into Jewish memory forever. In December of 167 BC, he walked into the temple in Jerusalem, set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus on the sacred altar, and sacrificed a pig on it, an unclean animal offered to a false god in the holiest place the Jewish people had. The prophet Daniel had seen something like this coming, calling it the thing that profanes the temple and sets up the abomination that makes desolate. Centuries later, Jesus himself would reach back to this moment and use it as a warning sign of judgment still to come. But the Jews did not lie down and die. In a small town called Modin, a priest named Mattathias watched an official order a Jewish man to make a pagan sacrifice, and something in him broke loose. He killed the official, tore down the altar, and fled into the hills with his 5 sons. The revolt had begun. It's named after one of those sons, Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, which likely means the hammer. And the Maccabean revolt is one of the most improbable military stories of the ancient world. A ragged band of religious fighters, hopelessly outmatched, taking on the army of an empire and winning. In December of 164 BC, exactly 3 years after the temple was defiled, Judas and his men retook Jerusalem and rededicated the temple to God. That rededication is why Hanukkah exists, the Feast of Dedication. And here's a detail that ties the silence straight into the Gospels. Centuries later, the Gospel of John shows Jesus walking through the temple during that very festival, the Feast of Dedication, celebrating a holiday that was born in the gap between the Testaments, standing in the space the Maccabees had bled to reclaim. They won their freedom. What they did with it is one of the saddest turns in the whole story. After the revolt, the Maccabees founded their own ruling family, the Hasmonean dynasty. For the first time in more than 400 years, Israel governed itself. And the Hasmonean rulers held 2 offices at once. They were kings and high priests. That combination is exactly where it went wrong. The men who had fought to keep the faith pure slowly let power corrupt the very thing they'd fought for. The high priesthood, meant to be a sacred office held by the right family, passed down with care, became a political prize, handed out and yanked back for political reasons. Hasmonean rulers cut deals with foreign powers. They turned on each other, and by the end, 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, were locked in a civil war over the throne, and in their desperation, each made the same catastrophic move. Each one invited Rome to step in and settle it for them. They had no idea what they were inviting. It's also in these years that the 2 groups who fill the pages of the Gospels finally take shape. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees, the name comes from a word meaning the separated ones, were devoted to keeping the written law, plus a whole body of oral tradition passed down alongside it. They were popular with ordinary people, they operated through the synagogues, and they believed in the resurrection of the dead, in angels, and in God's active hand over history. Every synagogue Jesus teaches in, every scribe who tests him on the law, comes out of this world. The Sadducees were the opposite number, aristocratic, wealthy, centered on the temple, and politically connected. They accepted only the written law and rejected the oral traditions. And crucially, they did not believe in the resurrection, which is exactly why, in the Gospels, they try to trap Jesus with an absurd riddle about a woman married to 7 brothers in turn. They were trying to make the resurrection sound ridiculous, and behind both groups sat the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish council, 70 members plus the high priest, with roots reaching back into these silent centuries. It's the body that will one day put Jesus on trial. It's the court the apostles will be dragged before in the book of Acts. Nearly every clash between Jesus and the religious authorities is a clash with institutions that didn't exist when Malachi laid down his pen. The entire cast of the Gospels was assembled in the dark. And now the last and greatest empire arrives, the one that will still be standing when the child is born in Bethlehem. While the 2 Hasmonean brothers tore at each other, the Roman general Pompey was busy folding the Eastern Mediterranean into Rome's growing empire. Both brothers came to him for help. Pompey chose a side, and in 63 BC he marched on Jerusalem. The city fell, thousands were killed, and then Pompey did something that shook the Jewish world to its foundations. He walked into the temple, past the outer courts, past the inner courts, past the veil, and straight into the Holy of Holies. This was the one place on earth where only the high priest could go, and only once a year, and only after elaborate ritual carrying blood. Pompey, a pagan, a foreigner, a conqueror, simply strolled in to have a look. And according to Josephus, he was baffled by what he found. Every other religion he'd encountered kept a statue of its god in its innermost shrine. Pompey expected an idol. Instead, he found an empty room. No image, no statue, nothing his eyes could rest on, because the God of Israel could not be reduced to anything human hands could carve. Pompey didn't loot the temple, he left it intact. But the violation was total. The most sacred space in the world had been strolled through by a pagan general, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. From 63 BC on, Israel belonged to Rome, and Rome preferred to rule through a local strongman rather than govern directly. That strongman was Herod. In 40 BC, the Roman Senate named him King of the Jews, though Herod was Jewish only by practice, not by blood. His ancestry traced back to Edom, Israel's ancient rival. He was politically shrewd, deeply paranoid, and obsessed with building. He tore down and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem on a scale so grand it became one of the wonders of the ancient world. The temple Jesus would teach in, drive the money changers out of, and predict the fall of, that was Herod's temple, raised during the silence. Herod is the king still on the throne when the story finally breaks open. He's the one the wise men visit, and the one who, in his terror of a rival king, orders the slaughter of the infants of Bethlehem. The silence ends in his shadow. Now step back and look at the whole board, because from ground level those 400 years look like random turbulence, one empire after another, war after war, tragedy after tragedy. But from above, every single piece has been set exactly where it needs to be. There is one language the whole Mediterranean can understand, Greek, so that when the message goes out, everyone can hear it, and when it's written down, everyone can read it. There is a Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, sitting in synagogues scattered across the entire empire, so that wherever the first preachers go, the scriptures pointing to the Messiah are already there, already known in the common tongue. There is a network of Roman roads, the finest the world has ever seen, connecting every major city, the very roads Paul will travel for thousands of miles to plant churches. And there is the Roman peace holding the whole empire quiet enough to make that travel possible. There is a Jewish people scattered into every corner of that empire, each community gathered around a synagogue and a shared set of scriptures, so that the gospel has a doorway waiting in every city. And there is a level of hope, of hunger, of straining expectation for the Messiah that 4 centuries of foreign boots and unanswered prayers had wound to the breaking point. The people were watching the horizon. One language, one road system, one scattered people carrying one book to every nation. All of it finished, all of it ready, and all of it built during the years God supposedly wasn't speaking. The New Testament has a phrase for the moment it all came together. It says that when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son. Not a random moment, the full moment, the one instant when everything was finally in place. So here's what I want to leave you with. Most of us assume that when God is quiet, God is absent. If there's no voice, nothing is happening. If the prophet isn't speaking, heaven has stopped caring. The 400 years say the exact opposite. While no prophet spoke, God was spreading a language the gospel would be written in. While no scripture was given, God was translating the scriptures he'd already given into the tongue of the whole world. While there was no voice from heaven, God was laying roads, raising up and tearing down empires, and positioning one small nation at the crossroads of the most connected world that had ever existed, so that the moment his Son arrived, the news could reach everywhere. That silence was, by what it accomplished, one of the most productive stretches of history ever recorded. And that has something to say to wherever you are right now. Almost everyone knows a season that feels like silence, a prayer that's gone unanswered longer than you can stand, a door that won't open, a promise that hasn't come. From the inside, those stretches feel like God has simply gone quiet. But the gap between the testaments whispers a different possibility, that the silence isn't the absence of the story. Sometimes it's the part of the story where the road is being built. Because when the silence finally broke, it broke with a voice in the wilderness. A man named John sent, the Gospels say, in the spirit and power of Elijah, the very Elijah that Malachi had promised on the last page of the Old Testament 400 years before. God had made a promise and then gone quiet, but he was keeping it the whole time in a language the prophets weren't writing down. He was never really silent. He was working at a frequency no one was recording. And if that's true of 400 years, it may be true of whatever quiet season you're standing in right now. If this filled in the gap for you, there's more waiting right here. The parts of the Bible people skip right over. Explained. Subscribe and stay with us.